Hi folks, welcome to week 11 of our course on the social impact of technology. So this week marks the first week where we are a bit disembodied and working from home or wherever it is that we like to work as we keep socially self-isolated and away from each other while this wretched virus makes its rounds. So this week we're going to talk about how technology affects our work and how this is going to go down. The agenda for today is I'm going to be recording this voiceover to the slides, and they're going to be sort of in two short little sections in these kind of video narration formats. So the first insight I'm going to talk to you about is how technology changes the structure of society. So we'll chat a little bit about division of labor. I'll introduce you to technological paradox number 2, and we'll talk a little bit about income inequality. We'll have a break, and then you can click on the next slideshow video thing. I don't quite know what to call these yet. And we'll talk to you about insight number 2, which looks at how technology changes the patterns of how we work. And I'm going to give us 2 case studies to think about. So hopefully short and sweet. Alrighty. So let's get started. So for insight number 1, we're going to take a look at how it is that technology changes the structures of society, so the basic organizations of society. And when we think about work, we most often think about manufacturing and the kind of division of labor that we see here in a classic factory where each row appears to be engaging in a different assembling task. And people are organized in such a way that when the product reaches a certain point, then it's added or things come together. And that creates the organization and a division of labor. Because as you can see, people are not working on the same things. So a division of labor generally refers to a way of organizing a structure so that people are contributing different parts of their labor to the greater whole. So this isn't an industrial era sort of invention. In fact, in 430-ish BCE, Xenophon, one of the great pre-Socratic philosophers, had pointed out that one earns a living by stitching shoes, another by cutting them out, another by sewing the uppers, and then there's another who performs none of these, but only assembles this part. So what we get a sense here, even in ancient times, is that labor is divided into parts in order to make a whole. So what this tells us is something really quite interesting about how technology influences the nature of work. It tells us that labor becomes divided on the grounds of the kinds of technologies that are available. And if we're looking at human history, we have divided into pre-agricultural, post-agricultural revolution, and then the urbanization and industrialization phase of human history. And what we generally see is in the pre-agricultural revolution stage, so we're talking cavemen here, that people, because they existed in very small groups, didn't have specialization of their tasks. They were essentially a jack of all trades. So you would know how to fasten a bow or hunt wild boars or cook on a open fire. You just had to because it was a matter of survival. But with the changes that staying put, which is what you have to do when you are agricultural, and we're looking at the time period of about 12,000 years ago, we see a spike in advances in technology. Now, this isn't to say that pre-agricultural folks did not have technology. They had tons of really ingenious ways of using animals and their bones and remains to create everything from more hunting implements to clothing to sacks to carry things. But what we do see with the post-agricultural revolution is, because settlements are stationary, different kinds of technology and a rise in specialization and division of labor starts to occur. Later in human history, so we're talking the medieval-ish period, and onward, that through urbanization and industrialization, these dense settlements give rise to even more specialized jobs, including religious practitioners or makers of things like shoemakers or tailors or coopers. This specialization creates complex modes of civil and military forms of organization. It also advances occupational specializations, which flourish as a result in that results in higher craftsmanship and better quality products. And the extension of that is that it produces entirely new goods and services. So, in other words, the extension of a division of labor beyond specialized workers creates a system that is broken up, much like what we saw in the image earlier with the assembly process broken up by function. The result of all of this is, of course, new forms of economic relationships. So when jobs are specialized, of course, the technology becomes specialized, and then that creates another network for things that have to be created in order for a product to be made. So it gets quite extensive, as you can imagine. And I'll just say here too, guilds are a really interesting marker of a division of labor, because what they do is sort of create classifications of people who are all doing sort of the same things, and it creates kind of a society of tailors or coopers or millers, and they can share their experiences, their best practices, and how to continue to specialize and create better quality products of that sort. So we get a sense that technology plays a really formative role in how we divide our labor power. Of course, the economist Adam Smith had pointed out that this specialization and division of labor isn't from the goodness of the butcher. The butcher isn't cutting animals apart because they necessarily love it, but because it's part of a society and part of a way of contributing to society that is actually quite self-interested. You get paid to be a butcher or a brewer or a baker, and it's this specialization that contributes to a modern economy, because people can do the kinds of jobs that they feel that they're best suited for, or that they prefer, or that is in their immediate condition to do. And that creates the technology and the social structure to be able to continue to do this job. But of course, there's always a paradox, right? Because with a rise in greater technology, we also see a set of interesting assumptions that are made about progress and about specialization. So this is technological paradox number 2. And it rests on an assumption that the more technology a society has, the more leisure time that it will have to partake in. But of course, the reality, and we all know this because we live this, the reality is that the amount of work per capita actually increases with the evolution of culture, and the amount of leisure time per capita decreases. So in other words, technological paradox essentially points out that labor-saving technologies are generally used to increase income, not reduce the amount of hours to work. And when you think about it really soberly, the more technological advancements they are, the harder we have to work in order to afford the luxury of having these technological advancements. So the idea that they save time becomes paradoxical. A really neat example is of the Kungsan bush people. They are a nomadic tribe of people that basically work in a very focused way, and they work 2.5 days a week for 6 hours a day. They supply their basic needs by gathering up a kind of really yummy nut and supplementing this by hunting the meat of game animals. And they work together as a group to do this. And the rest of the time they just enjoy hanging out with each other, making music, making things to wear, and just generally having a good time. And this is a culture that, technologically speaking, has a rather limited range of technologies, yet they are living in many ways a more affluent life than some in more technologically advanced cultures. So that's technological paradox number 2. Now, if that's not a contradiction enough, there are some more contradictions that we need to be on the lookout for when we're talking about how technology impacts the way that we work, and especially the way in which we divide labor in a society. And over the past century, many of the jobs that are performed by manufacturing workers have been lost to mechanization. And we see this all the time, even within the past year or so. Huge manufacturing employers in our province of Ontario have shut down, leaving entire cities of people who relied on that place to work completely upended. And it's not just the manufacturing plant that these sorts of job loss affects. It is the entire community. It's where people go for their morning cup of coffee, or where they buy their newspaper, or where they go to take their kids to go play after school. All of these things become affected. So with the loss of manufacturing due to mechanization and making robots and AI and just more efficient ways of making things, there is a really interesting paradox that's happened, because the total employment has actually increased. So this gives us a sense that people from one industry are beginning to become employed in another one. So the bulk of job creation hasn't been in manufacturing, it's actually in the service sector. So in things like medicine, education, entertainment, law enforcement, wholesale and resale, as well as transportation. And many jobs in manufacturing have actually been converted over to service occupations. So for example, independent consulting engineers would have been classified as manufacturing based, but these are service sector jobs. It was interesting to note that the number of workers performing these service type functions in manufacturing is large and growing, and this indicates a further change in the nature of work. So while we focus on the service sector, the desire for service sector work shows no sign of abating. Certainly in Canada, this does generate a great deal of unpredictable kinds of jobs, but they are jobs and they are keeping people paid and working and living with some meaning in their lives. Now it is a bit contradictory, because when you think of the ways in which we classify jobs as economic units, these are jobs that don't produce materials. They are a service. So economically, we're faced with asking the question how it is that jobs that don't produce materials are economically viable. But it is safe to say that jobs in the service sector are quite safe to have. Like, we often talk about how manufacturing is the real way that people should have jobs, but when you consider that in the service sector, people prefer other humans to machines. For example, in medicine, we are really reluctant to have robots treat us for our illnesses. We rely on a human to give advice and offer us care. And these sorts of positions rely on things like trust and building relationships and human contact. So, our takeaway here is that we can see some safety in a society that is built upon the service sector rather than manufacturing alone. The last point I want to make before we take a little break is about income inequality, because one of the other aspects of the way in which technology shapes our social structures is that it also leads to the emergence of many new and incredibly highly paying occupations and business opportunities on the one hand. But on the other hand, technological change has been implicated in diminished economic opportunities and overall reduction in wages for significant portions of the labor force. So we have this kind of spike in high-paying occupations, but then a drop in overall wages around the world. So I'm going to leave this here for now, and if you want to take a break and delve deeper into this idea, I have posted an article that talks about, actually it's not an article, my apologies, it is a visual, like an infographic that looks at where the world's wealth is and gives us a sense of how technology is implicated in this really challenging problem of widening the gap between the rich and the poor. So let's take a little break, and I will see you in the next video when we look at insight number 2.